The next item on our agenda being his statement as Vice President of the Commission, High Representative for Foreign Affairs, his statement on the death of Mahsa Amini and the repression of women's rights protesters in Iran. Mr. Borrell, as soon as you've taken your seat, sir, I will ask you to please, without further ado, move to the Speaker's pulpit. But of course, I will give you a few seconds, sir, just to catch your breath. Mr. Borrell, now it's your turn.
And if you are ready, the floor is yours. No, you have.
Excuse me, President. Excuse me, honourable members. I was running from one phone call to a meeting, but here am I. Sorry for being late. Mr. President, honourable members of the European Parliament, it's important to have this opportunity to discuss today what is happening across Iran after the death of a young woman. Mahsa Amini was arrested by the police and appeared dead, was killed during his arrest in the police station. Let me express my condolences to the family. This is something that has to be said, although it's not going to be very useful for them. Also, let me express our admiration for the demonstration, mainly women and men also across Iran, protesting by her killing and the repression that they have suffered, that has cost tens of people killed. These are facts. They are not opinions. These are facts. On the streets of Iran, the repression of the demonstrators has left behind tens of people killed. Mahsa Amini was only 22 years old. She was visiting the capital of her country. And the morality police, even the name morality police sounds bizarre to our ears, detained and mistreated her simply because of her headscarf, and she ended up in hospital where she died shortly after. These are facts. Following her passing, should I say her killing, we have seen a wave of indignation and outrage turning into nationwide protest in Iran. Iranians, and especially young Iranians, have taken the streets to express their anger, their aspirations for a better future, free from oppression. There are countless testimonies of brave women and men expressing their dissent in their cities on social media. We have seen them chanting woman, life, freedom, three key words. These Iranian women have been the force driving the dissent. They ask for respect, justice, and equality. Nothing more, nothing less. As the European Union representatives, we call immediately for the Iranian authorities to ensure the respect of fundamental rights of Iranian citizens. In a meeting in New York, President Michel and I had with the Iranian President Raisi. We raised this situation directly to him and called for accountability for the death of Mahsa Amini and restraint in the government's reaction to the demonstrations. Unfortunately, did not happen. Numerous reports clearly show that the response of the Iranian security and police forces has been disproportionate and resulted, as he said, in tens or dozens of lives lost. Many more have been injured and detained, including several journalists covering the events. And we have to see clear indications of a credible investigation that could ensure accountability for what has happened. Accountability, not at all. Also, the internet has been shut down in many areas of the country. Iranians and the world lost access to information about what was happening there, as well as the opportunity to use online platforms to express their dissent, which is another deliberate violation of freedom of expression in the country. I think it's important here at the European Parliament to show a strong and united reaction by the European Union. On my side, on behalf of the 27 member states, I publicly expressed in my declaration of September 25th the widespread and disproportionate use of force against non-violent protesters and consider that the way it is, unjustifiable and unacceptable. People in Iran, as anywhere else, have the right to peaceful protest. It's as simple as that. And it's clear that this right has not been ensured. Together with the member states, we will continue to consider all the options at our disposal, including restrictive measures, to address the killing of Mahsa Amini and the way Iranian security forces have been responded to the demonstration. I will raise this at the next Foreign Affairs Council with my colleagues. And when I am saying restrictive measures, I am using the wording of the treaty, because in the treaty you will not find the word sanctions. The only thing that you will find in the treaty is restrictive measures. And that's it what I am talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President. And I now call the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, David McAllister.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. High Representative, Vice President, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. The massive protests that erupted following the death of Mahsa Amini in police custody have spread over to 171 cities in all 31 provinces of Iran. The people are protesting against a deeply corrupt and violent regime that systematically oppresses women and responds to political resistance with brutal violence and repression. The violent crackdown of the mullah security forces on peaceful protesters must stop immediately. The Council ought to impose tough sanctions responding to serious human rights violations as soon as possible. Call them restrictive measures, call them tough sanctions. The main thing is they will be adopted sooner the better. The regime in Tehran has maneuvered itself into a dead end. As our President, Roberta Metsola, stated yesterday here in the plenary, we as European Parliament stand in solidarity with the brave women and men and all their democratic aspirations in their fight for women's human and minority rights, for the free flow of information and access to internet, and for a free, secular and democratic republic. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd now like to hand the floor to the President of the Group, the Progressive Alliance of Socialists and Democrats, Mrs. Garcia Perez.
Gracias, President.
Thank you, President. High Representative. In the middle of the 21st century, there is a police force in Iran which is there to check the respect of clothing standards by women. This police force detained a young woman because, according to them, she was showing more hair than she should from under her headscarf. This young woman did not leave the police station alive that they took her to. Incredible, But it's true. It's a nightmare. And this is the reality that all women experience in Iran because they're seen as citizens of a second category, as property of their husband, their father, their brother. If a man kills his daughter, he'll be sent to prison for just a few years because there are no laws that protect women. But if a woman kills a man who has raped her, she is hanged the following day. The Iranian regime is repressing the protesters violently and brutally, and women, obviously here, are the first to protest because right from the outset the authorities try to reduce them to nothing, but women have been fighting right from the beginning. They've managed to achieve small victories, but unfortunately it's not enough. The death of Mahsa Amini has lit a flame which could perhaps lead to the end of a dark regime which is anchored in the Middle Ages. And we've seen that more and more Iranians are raising their voices and going out into the streets to protest, risking their lives. And there are many people who have died as a result of these protests. This has not been admitted by the Iranian authorities. The renegotiation of the nuclear agreement with Iran, which is ongoing at the moment, and the specific position of the country in the middle of an energy crisis around the world means that we cannot look away. We have to look clearly at what's happening in Iran, and Europe has to respond. Europe has to support the women in Iran because it's the women in Iran who are leading this protest. Women, lives and freedom. So Iranian women, we stand by you.
Ich erteile Frau Maria Soraya
Mrs. Soraya Ramos has the floor.
Presidente.
Thank you, President. Mahsa Amini was detained, beaten on the way to police station and beaten to death there. Unfortunately, her murder is nothing unusual or casual. It's part of a state policy against women's rights. And so Amini today has inspired thousands of women to be brave enough to go out on the street and protest against a regime which for 43 years has sought to reduce them to exploitation, oppression and exclusion. Iranian society has come out onto the streets in support of the women. High Representative, they're still there, calling for their freedom against a repressive, dictatorial, theocratic regime. That's why they're calling for real change. They're calling for a democratic regime. Violence to repress the protest is nothing new, nor is impunity in Iran. We saw what happened in the protests in 2019 and 2021 in April of this year there. The European Union in 2019 issued penalties against Hossein Salami, who was then in charge of the Revolutionary Guards. Now he's a member of the National Security Council in charge of organizing the repression of the protests with live fire. And so, High Representative, we need to renew and update the sanctions. We need to extend the sanctions. That's how we can stand by the people of Iran on behalf of all the women who have died because of them.
Thank you. Next speaker, Mr. Ortasun. Thank you very much. Events unfolding in Iran are unprecedented, particularly over the last week. I would like to give my unwavering support to all the protesters who have taken to the streets to protest. We're talking about many casualties, and we're talking about many still protesting against the murder of Mahsa Amini, who was arrested, tortured and killed. The Iranian authorities 2 weeks later have still not taken any responsibility for what happened. We should call upon the authorities in Iran to conduct an investigation into what happened, to make sure that human rights defenders are protected. This is yet another case of discrimination against women because of discriminatory codes pertaining to clothing. Women in Iran have been protesting peacefully against rules pertaining to the hijab, and they're protesting because of the breach of their fundamental rights. We stand in solidarity with all of them. These protests have become a movement, and it's a sign of disquiet that is being expressed by women and men in Iran against a government that is systematically oppressing all dissidents. As far as the European Union is concerned and its member states, we would urge you to take all available channels in order to put pressure upon the authorities of Iran to put an end to these laws and these practices that deprive women of their rights and their autonomy. Respect for human rights has to be part and parcel of the relations that we have with the European Union and Iran. We cannot have a situation where these rights are not respected. This, is a situation where we cannot leave these women alone. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Jean-Paul Garot is the next speaker.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Mahsa Amini, a young woman, 22 years old, has died beaten by the morality police because she was not wearing her Islamic veil correctly. And then another person was killed by police bullets for the same reason. And very many young women in Iran are fighting for their rights. But for many years now, the European Union has been taking part in the promotion of wearing this veil in the European Union. And the European Commission co-financed this campaign, saying that liberty is in the hijab. Last February, during the course of the Conference on the Future of Europe, this slide was published. Future is in your hands, and it shows a woman wearing a hijab. This is a future of Europe that our people do not want. On the 21st of September, during the course of a campaign for Erasmus+, the Commission showed this slide showing a girl wearing a veil, a young girl wearing a veil. And again, on the 21st of September, Femiso, a women's movement, on the premises of the European Parliament and on an invitation from the Socialist group, it was basically a proselytism exercise for veils for women. And 23 million euro have been put forward to different associations refusing to integrate with European values. And some of these people have come along here to speak against Islamophobia in France. This is not acceptable. The citizens expect of the European Union that they do not convert to Islamism. And we do not want this support for the Ayatollahs. Thank you.
Kollege Garot, ich muss Ihnen sagen.
Mr. Garot, I would have to say that what you've just said and the views you've expressed in your statements are not in line with the rules of procedure, and I would urge you to respect the rules of procedure of the House. I'd now like to turn to Asita Kanko. You have the floor.
Dear colleagues, the women who are now rising up against the Islamic brutality in Iran know what freedom is and why we must protect it. Those who defend the headscarf in Europe should take a good look at these women and learn what real courage is. It's not in the veil. It's also not inside a dependent man. A dependent man is a healthy man who cannot cook his own meal, who cannot do his own dishes, who cannot clean his own house, control his own sexuality or do his own damn laundry, or be responsible of his own life. I can understand that men cannot bear children, but I strongly refuse to be enslaved as a woman, refuse to see women be enslaved today, tortured and killed because they want to wear a T-shirt. This darkness that many still carry must stop. Therefore, all men should become independent and self-sufficient. That is your best contribution to the emancipation of women. An independent man is a healthy man who does all his things by himself and picks the right side in the fight for freedom. It's a man who is not scared of women's intelligence and potential, not scared of their opinions, not scared of their ideas or sexuality. It's a man who knows that men are responsible of their own sexuality. It's a man who does not expect his wife or daughter to wear the hijab to protect men from their femininity. He clearly takes their side in the fight against the subjection of women. As women, we must also take our own side and fight to be first, work together to be respected. The Iranian women are showing us the way. A woman died for freedom. Together, we need to say that we understand how they feel and support them.
Merci beaucoup.
Yes, thank you very much.
Madame Manon Aubry.
Mrs. Manon Aubry.
The floor is yours.
Shame. Shame on those who murdered Mahsa Amini and so many other women just because a lock of hair was sticking out of their veil. Shame on the militias of the Iranian Islamic dictatorship who take away women's freedom of movement. Shame on this obscurantist patriarchal regime that gags, crushes and imprisons women and all those who mobilise alongside them. Shame on the theocracy of the mullahs whose oppression of women and the obligation to wear the veil are the keystone. Shame on Emmanuel Macron, who shook hands with President Raisi when the police were firing on the crowds under his orders. Shame on the heads of state who just stare at their shoes when the Iranians who are mobilising need support and their executioners need punishment. With these simple words, Iranian women are leading the battle of all women under fire and bringing with them a whole people united against corruption, dictatorship and injustice. Their courage is humbling. Our solidarity must never waver. We must fight everywhere and all the time against the oppression of women, for the conquest of their freedom in Iran, as well as for the defence of their fundamental rights to control their own bodies in the United States, in Hungary, in Poland. What hypocrisy on the part of the extreme right to come and lecture us here, because you are the first to actually prevent women from having right over their bodies. So as a tribute to the struggle of Iranian women, I would like to end with the lines of a poet, Mona Bouzoué, who was arrested for these words: "Her hair, a flag that the night has soiled, will take it back in the shadow of your claws. Oh, magma of lies, oh, you frightened one, will take this country back from your clutches." Thank you.
Merci. Nun spricht Herr Kost.
Thank you. Mr. Papadakis.
Καταδικάζουμε τη στιγερή δολοφονία της Mahsa Amini.
Yes, thank you very much. We condemn the assassination of Mahsa Amini as an Iranian. The assassination of Mahsa Amini and the deaths of many people during the protests and the arrests as well are proof of the violence of the violent nature of this state and the oppression that exists in this country. But then we have the hypocrisy of the European Union, and we would also have to condemn that. We seem to have a la carte sensitivity when it comes to women in Iran, because there are women in other countries that are suffering in a similar fashion, but we don't condemn that. The protests in Iran are being manipulated and being turned into an instrument of the imperialist fight, which is being waged in a similar way in Ukraine. These protests are being used in favour of capitalist exploitation and submission of women.
Mrs. Fitzgerald is the next one.
Thank you, Vice President, High Representative. Women in Iran are fighting for their fundamental rights, their freedom. The shocking and unlawful death of a young woman of 22, Mahsa Amini, is a stark reminder of the abuse and violence women face every day from the regressive Iranian regime. Women and men have rightly taken to the streets to protest at the barbaric and honestly sickening treatment of women by the Iranian state and their so-called morality police. What morality, I ask? Whose values? Whose morals? Certainly not women's. We in this chamber must join the Iranian people and condemn this use of violence against women. And the continued use of such disproportionate violence against protesters is abhorrent and emblematic of such an autocratic regime. We must support women to have choice in the way that they live. We must support the fundamental rights of all women to live life as they see fit, free from state-sponsored violence. The stories emerging are really totally unacceptable. They are dreadful, and I urge the High Representative to do everything in his power to take action against the state in a united way across Europe. Like so many of the women of Iran, Mahsa was brave and courageous. We must ensure that her death was not in vain. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Evin Insia, you are the next one.
Her name was Gina Mahsa Amini, a young Kurdish girl in Iran with her whole life ahead of her, deprived of her life by men and a regime who thinks they have the right to control women. For over 40 years, women, girls, minorities, and oppositional groups have lived in horror. The Iranian feminist revolution is a democratic revolution that is taking place right now. The autocratic regime might think that they can suffocate and silence the people, but what they do is to fuel the anger. Right now, Iranian, Kurdish, Baluch, and many other groups, especially the women and young, leveraging their righteous wrath and shout, the day of the regimes are numbered. The cruel morality police and all of those in the government behind the oppression of the people must be sanctioned. The discrimination laws that constitute the basis of the gender apartheid in the country must be abolished. The murderers of Gina and all those freely demonstrating and protesting must be brought to justice. We need to end impunity. To be silent is to be compliant. Compliance can't be the way forward for the international community if we truly stand for what we preach: democracy, human rights, equality, and justice. The cause of all women and people in Iran is our cause. Their freedom is our freedom. Jin, Jian, Azadi, woman, life, freedom.
Thank you. Madam Chair Katalin, you are the next one.
Dear colleagues, dear High Representative, please allow me to start my remarks with a message addressed not to this chamber but to the women of Iran. Your courage is breathtaking. As you rise up against injustice, as you dare to defy the oppressive regime, you inspire the fight for women's rights everywhere. And as you honor the memory of Mahsa Amini, who was brutally murdered, you are teaching the world a lesson in solidarity, so that no woman is harassed or killed because of a bigoted dress code ever again. We salute and admire your bravery. And colleagues, our support cannot be limited only to words. European diplomacy needs to swing into action now. We need targeted personal sanctions, travel bans, asset freezes against members of the Iranian regime, and also including careful and strict implementation of every single existing sanction. And we also need to help those whose lives are in danger by issuing humanitarian visas. The people of Iran who take the streets, the women who remove or burn their headscarves, they are risking their lives doing so. They deserve help from the European Union and the international community as a whole. Let's show them that we are on their side. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mrs. Diana Riva Jinet.
Gracias, President.
Thank you. Woman, life and freedom, this is just more than a fighting slogan. It's been shouted out by a Kurdish woman, Iranian women. It means that a society cannot exist without women who are free. If we take a look at a world where we see ever more totalitarianism, then the word freedom, or freedom, is associated with women, Hanan Kia, Mahsa Amini and others. And women in Iran are risking their lives for the right to life on their own terms and to destroy the patriarchy and the regime, which is suppressing them, discriminating against them, and submitting them. And their fight for and their resistance is an example for all of us. From here, I would like to send out a message of admiration. I'd just like to say that we stand with you, and we will always stand with women who are demanding freedom for themselves and their societies. Jindan Azadi.
Thank you. Madame Anna Bonfrisco.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. And thank you as well, High Representative. Many of us would have liked to see the European Union being equally bold in boycotting the inauguration of the President. You thought the elections were fraudulent. Well, shouldn't you be clearer about the sanctions? Make them the toughest and truest sanctions we have. And we have to recognise all the massacres carried out by the Iranian regime since 1988 right up until today. We need to be clearer in defining as a crime against humanity any arbitrary imprisonment, torture and killing to which women and girls and all the minorities in Iran are subjected. Need to bring about international investigations into the injustices perpetrated by Raisi and his whole regime against the Iranian people. They're making no contribution to humanity, only death and terror. We have to be clearly opposed to this veil which brings blood and death. And the women, the hair of the women of Iran is our hair, which hold out a future of freedom.
Mr. Charlie Weimers.
Thank you, Mr. President. Evil empire, that's what President Reagan dared to call the Soviet Union. Remember that? Soviet dissident Nathan Sharansky does. He fondly remarked, "I remember what a burst of enthusiasm this gave us. When the West finally saw the Soviet Union for what it was, there would be hope for victory." Words matter. The Iranian people beg us to be their voice, and we should. But words must be matched by action, and this requires soul-searching here in Europe. Political prisoners and young girls don't get a burst of enthusiasm when European politicians don hijabs in front of the regime in Tehran. Iranian-supplied suicide drones to Russia are used to kill Ukrainians, while Brussels clings on to a dead nuclear deal. Where are the Magnitsky sanctions against the ruling elite already? Will protesters chanting Zen, Zendegi, Azadi, woman, life, freedom, be given a hope for victory as liberals and socialists normalize relations with the murdering mullahs? Mr. High Representative, join me in declaring what the brave Iranian people already know all too well. The Islamic Republic is an evil republic.
Okay. Am Wort ist Frau Cornelia.
Thank you. Mrs. Cornelia Ernst.
Tja, was sagt es über...
Well, yes. What does it say about a regime when this regime causes the death of a young woman because she wasn't wearing her veil properly? What it says is that we have to close the chapter on a regime of this kind. Anybody who, in the name of God, kills people is not respecting God, and we will never stop defending women who try and fight against this kind of suppression, and we will never stop protesting about Iran with our hearts and souls, because anybody protesting in Iran is justified. Iranian women have long been a catchword for protest and freedom, because they want to be free to be able to breathe and live their lives as they want and to be accepted as women. When it comes to the desire for freedom and equality, you cannot just suffocate it or damn it. Iran is a beautiful country. It has long-reaching history and culture, but I think the time has come to start a new chapter written in a woman's hand, because enough is enough.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bogdaman, Mr. Puigdemont.
Protest is a cry for freedom, for their freedom and for the freedom of the forgotten women of Afghanistan or Africa. We respect their protest for what it is. They rebel against the dictatorship of men who imprison them, bully them, torture them, limit their lives simply because they are women and want to live in equality. There is a common thread that connects this protest with the protest of previous generations of women who took to the streets because they were not allowed to vote, they were not allowed to be involved in politics, they were not allowed to work in the same jobs as men, they were not allowed to earn the same salary as them. They ask for complete freedom. They ask to be able to live and to do with their future and their bodies what they want. Decide their lives for themselves in full freedom. That's why they should azadi, 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 freedom, freedom, freedom. And we must listen to this cry. We must help it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Herr Tsatsarlechos, the floor is yours.
Mr. Tsatsarlechos.
17 days have passed since protests began following the killing of Mahsa Amini in Iranian police facilities. How many Iranians have been killed? Hundreds. How many have been arrested or injured? Thousands. We don't know for sure. Women are beaten and dragged away by police. But let us get it right. This is not only about mandatory veiling or hijab. This is about basic freedom. This is about a regime founded on systematic repression and cruelty against its people. A regime headed by someone fully involved in the massacre of 1988, a crime against humanity that has already come to European courts, as a Swedish court has imposed a life sentence on an Iranian official for taking part in this crime. There is an uprising going on in Iran, and we have not only to condemn repression, but to support the victims of repression. We need to send a clear sign of our concern and condemnation, but also an unequivocal message of support. Europe means pluralism, democracy, freedom of religion, respect for all beliefs, equal rights between men and women. And those Iranians struggling for their rights, risking their lives, deserve to see Europe firmly on their side. Europe at its best, friendly, supportive and committed. There should be specific demands to the Iranian government on the release of prisoners and accountability of perpetrators, no matter how long it takes. But neither the nuclear deal or the oil resources of Iran can justify turning a blind eye or water down our response. Appeasement, we should know, never works.
Merci, Madame Arena Maria.
Mrs. Maria Arena.
Merci. Depuis la mort de Mahsa Amini.
Thank you. Since the death of Mahsa Amini, the young woman, the victim of the Iranian morality police, victim of not having worn her hijab properly. Dozens of people have died and thousands have been arrested for calling for their freedom. The clerics say that these demonstrations are being stirred up by foreign interference, but these protesters are calling for just one thing: the end of a regime which oppresses them, closes them up and massacres them. The EU is proposing to show to deal with the regime. We have to show our solidarity with the demonstrators and human rights defenders in the country. We have to call for targeted sanctions and include human rights in all discussions and agreements with Iran. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you. Mrs. Hilde Woutmans.
Thank you very much and good evening, dear President, dear High Representative, dear colleagues. Over 100 deaths and still counting. We all know the brutal story. Public protests in Iran broke out after Amini died in custody, after she was arrested for not wearing the hijab correctly. We cannot close our eyes to these atrocities. We must pursue a clear strategy in which we put women's rights on the top of the agenda. As Madeleine Albright once said, there is a special place in hell for women who don't help women. Therefore, Mr. Borrell, if you don't want to go to hell, and I think you don't want to go to hell, I really urge you, provide access to our European universities, support civil society in their fight for women's rights, protect human rights defenders, and target directly the leaders and people who are responsible for these crimes. Let's never give up on women, the life and the liberty in Iran. They need our help. Thank you very much.
Danke.
Yes, thank you very much. Mrs. Alice Cornwell.
Tack, herr talman.
Thank you very much, President. It started with Jina Mahsa Amini, but there were people imprisoned, there were people injured, there were people murdered, there were many, many more faces and just as many names. The executioners, the murderers, those complicit, there are also many of them. We know who they are, and we know that they should be held accountable for their actions. What about us, the rest of us, those of us who can make a choice, choose our lives as we should, and do what we can with what we have? Peace and freedom is not something that comes free of charge, handed to you on a silver platter. There are brave women and children in Iran who are taking to the streets, and they have proven how expensive freedom is, what a price you have to pay. I think that at the end of the day, we will have to see whether this battle was worth it or not. Only subsequently will we know. It seems to me that the peace movement, freedom movement in Iran needs to have every support from us. Zen Zendegi Azadi.
Very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Deuvo Hakkarainen.
Honourable President, when the religious police batters a woman to death in Iran, the feminists in Europe remain silent. Are the religious rules more important than this woman's right to live? Who would have defended her here in Europe? Would she even have been accused of being Islamophobic? I would not be surprised by that either. Europe can and must condemn the repression of women by Iran and Islam. But will it change anything? Even if the current extremist Islamic theocracy were overthrown, it would just be replaced by a new Islamic regime. Would it be even more cruel or more moderate, is the only question. Islam and its idea of woman will not disappear anywhere. Importing Western democracy to the Muslim countries hasn't worked out to date. Neither did the earlier Arab revolutions change the situation in any way. In its neighboring country, Afghanistan, they have set up a new regime of terror. And what about the future of Europe? Dozens of millions of people that have been force-fed on that religion have been received here by open arms in Europe. And we have seen the results. Terror strikes all over. Would Europe finally learn its lesson? Thank you.
Mrs. Anna Fotiga.
Thank you, President. Mr. High Rep, Vice President, Mahsa Amini, the young Iranian woman of Kurdish origin, was beaten to death by so-called law enforcement forces of Iran. The regime directly responsible for her killing, as well as for violent crackdown, murderous violent crackdown of massive protests that followed this crime, has been led for already a few years by President Raisi, person directly responsible for judicial killings, crime against humanity towards the end of 1980s. Stop impunity for this kind of crimes. High Rep, there is highest time for us to impose as you say, restrictive measures against those who lead this kind of barbarous regimes. Thank you.
Danke vielmals. Ich bitte Herrn.
Thank you. Mr. Jörg Meuthen.
Herr Präsident.
President, honourable colleagues. The murder of Mahsa Amini, a young Iranian woman, by the so-called morality police is deeply disturbing, as is the brutal violence with which protests have been repressed. We're talking about hundreds of fatalities, casualties, people being put behind bars by this murderous regime in Iran. For too long, on the right and on the left, it has been supported by political forces, even in this House. I'm impressed by the courage of young people in Iran, young women in particular. They're risking their lives for a life in freedom, self-determination, and who are not being intimidated by the regime of the mullahs, the Revolutionary Guards, and their terror. This is a call for freedom, and we must heed this call for freedom. We cannot just speak about solidarity. The European Union needs to really target the regime in Iran with sanctions. That is what we owe to the courageous people of Iran. Thank you. Thank you very much. The next speaker, Mrs. Yelena Zovko.
Mr. High Commissioner, I deeply regret the death of Mahsa Amini. She was arrested for improperly wearing the hijab, a symbol of faith, and I had to experience an inexplicable amount of violence by the Iranian morality police, which led to her death. And it's as if the faith can come from the force. God is not in beating, but in loving. I strongly condemn the excessive actions by the Iranian authorities against the nationwide protests that have erupted after the incidents. The Iranian people are gathering in the streets to call for freedom, freedom of religion, freedom to exercise their basic human rights. Iran is a part of several international human rights treaties, but they fail to implement the binding principles enshrined in these legal documents. And I call on our European diplomatic services and the international community to monitor this process and to push for objective investigation of all other arrests and incidents relating to the protests. Thank you.
Danke, Frau Kollegin.
Thank you very much. Next is Mr. Robert Biedron.
Piekło kobiet trwa w Iranie od lat. Bieda, przemoc, ogromna.
Thank you very much, President. The situation is extremely regrettable for women. There is no protection for them against forced marriages, being raped within their marriage. This is something which is a daily situation in Iran. For 17 days, very brave women and girls have raised their voices. They are protesting against the regime.
They want to have their own rights. They want to fully exercise these rights. And so the question is, what will we do as a democracy to help them? Mr. President, it's not just a moral obligation, it's also a democratic obligation. We have to put in place sanctions against the Iranian regime. We have to raise this in every single conversation with the regime. We have to raise the issue of human rights. We cannot leave these women alone. These women must know that they will never be alone again. That's our responsibility. Thank you very much. Mr. Benageta next.
500, 800, 3,000 dead, perhaps more. We know that you, the Pazan, you're not going to be able to eliminate them to keep your power. Yes, this is a popular uprising. It is a women's uprising that is standing up for women and for freedom. And yes, perhaps you could snuff it out with your arms and your cynicism, but be careful. You will remember, I'm sure, you will remember the masses assembled in the presidential election in 1997 when your people were able to vote for a candidate for changeman. And you'll remember the uprising against the sham re-election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in 2009. And you will remember, of course, the demonstrations in 2019, 2020, and you'll remember the 8 million signatures against the execution of political prisoners. You will remember, and you will never forget, that the Iranian anger is only growing against your bloodthirsty incompetence, and you must remember, of course, that your end is nigh.
The next one is Mr. Shanik Jadot.
Chers collègues,
dear colleagues, how can we characterize this extraordinary movement being boldly spearheaded by women since the assassination of Mahsa Amini and so many others? It's not a revolt, it's a revolution, not an Islamist revolution, a revolution of the mullahs, which brought in a regime of oppression and assassinations and the imprisonment of demonstrators, human rights defenders and journalists. This regime which inspires fear in women and represses them using the law. Rather, what we are seeing is a revolution of consciences and hearts who have had enough of being suffocated and of suffering. This is a revolution of a civilization. Women are tearing off their veils and they are proclaiming liberty, equality, and the sisterhood. And that is why we must sanction the authors of these crimes. We must stand against those who sow terror and stand alongside those who fight for women, because their values are those of Europe.
Merci. Madame Isabella Tovaglieri.
Mahsa Amini.
Amini.
E chissà quanti altri.
And how many others? There are many, of course, that have not even been reported on in the newspapers. And I'm sure that we need to see just how many women will have to die before Europe takes a position against the Islamization of Europe and this regime in place. It is time for Brussels to move away from ambiguity. If we want to stand with these women who are currently combating, who are dying, to fight against this regime and not just use propaganda for the use of headscarves or social methods that would run counter to these women who are so courageous, women who are standing up and saying, women, life, liberty. Brussels, you cannot run counter to the trust of these women who believe that they will be able to live free of this oppression. We must stand up for our European values at this time, because what is currently happening in a country that seems very far away is without a doubt something that could just be a harbinger for the future here. Thank you.
Madame Veronika Vrečoniová.
Nejdříve mi dovolte vyjádřit upřímnou soustrast rodinné.
First and foremost, I'd like to express my condolences to the family of Mahsa Amini as well as other families whose members were killed during the protests. It is a clear sign that change must come. The current political direction is untenable. I would like to pay tribute to Iranian women who have gone up to the streets. They deserve our support, our respect. We need to do our utmost to support the opposition and the protesters who fight against the brutal regime's repressions. They fight for fundamental rights and freedoms. Without our help, Iran will continue to export terrorism, wish to gain nuclear weapons and provide threat to other countries. We need to send a clear message that these repressions will not escape justice. Thank you.
Speaker ist Frau Clara Ponsati-Obiols.
Thank you, President. Do you know who Zina Amini is? Yes. She is the woman who paid with her life for being free. However, everybody here has called her Mahsa, ignoring her Kurdish identity. Women in Iran are showing us how to fight for freedom. Sadly, this struggle has also become the perfect platform to show moral superiority without any real action. This is why nobody mentions that Amini was a Kurdish, or that the most brutal repression in this crisis is happening in Kurdistan. These links remain hidden because they exposed uncomfortable contradictions, like defending Kurdistan is difficult if one wants to be friends with Turkey, or that being what is being done to protect women in our countries that are forced by their communities to wear religious garments is basically nothing. We call this religious freedom, knowing that religion or freedom has nothing to do with it. The struggle of women in Iran is the new frontier of human rights, of women's rights, and we must rise above hypocrisy to support them with facts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Nun erteile ich Herrn Radoslav Sikorski.
Now, Mr. Sikorski has the floor.
Mr. President, High Representative, colleagues, there are moments in the history of man's struggle for liberty when only poetry will do. I recommend to you a song called Barai by Sherwin Hajpur, whose lyrics are put together from messages sent by protesters that describe what this is about. For dancing in the streets, for fear when kissing, for yearning of just normal life, for this polluted air, for tears with no end, for this forced heaven, for pills of nerves and insomnia, for women, life, freedom, for freedom, for freedom. Dear Iranian sisters, I hope you win this, but you are already our heroes. From the bottom of my heart, I salute you.
Danke, Herr Kollege.
Thank you very much. Ms. Burkhardt is the next speaker.
Vielen Dank, liebe Kolleginnen.
Thank you very much, colleagues. After the death of my grandfather, shortly after the founding of the Islamic Republic, my family fled to Europe to live in freedom. I have him to thank that here, as a young woman, I can stand here in public and to speak out the same freedom that these women are on the streets in Iran campaigning for. For years, they have been oppressed. Any move to freedom punished. They are oppressed through their religion, their identity. They're told what to wear. What we cannot see is that these people are there. They're fighting alone against a regime without scruples. Our support from Europe must be more tangible. We need to broaden sanctions from our side. we must punish them in terms of visas. We must ensure that asylum is provided. We must speak out loudly to strengthen the voice of the protesters in Iran for Zina Mahsa Amini, for women, for life, for freedom.
Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much. Frédéric Ries, next.
Zan, zendegi, osodi, les femmes, la vie, la liberté.
Women, life, liberty. These words have been ringing out across Iran for 18 days now, since Zina Mahsa Amini was killed in the north of Iran. She was young, she was Kurdish, and according to authorities, she was not wearing her hijab correctly. She won't be the last either, because we've had many, many deaths and thousands of arrests over the last 18 days. These women are courageous. They're being joined by men and students and sports stars. We've got Feda Azul from the national football team, an icon who is defying the authorities on behalf of women. And what are we doing, Mr. Borrell? We've got 7 countries calling for additional sanctions, targeted, smart sanctions, and I was delighted to hear you supporting those calls for sanctions. It is absolutely vital that we respond, because we have our freedoms. We should say her name, Mahsa Amini.
Frau Terry Reintke.
Ms. Terry Reintke next.
Dear colleagues, human dignity, freedom, democracy, values that we claim to hold very dear in the European Union, values that are the basis of the functioning of our societies. And now we see a protest movement in Iran that is fighting for exactly these values, led by brave women, a protest movement that has come together and that can change not only Iran, but the whole region and eventually the whole world, with a force and determination that is unprecedented. People are going to the streets, and they go to the streets knowing full well that they can sacrifice their own life doing this. And they rightfully ask us, what are your words, your declarations, your banners worth if now, in this moment, you are not standing with us? So the EU's response has to be clear. More sanctions, a more determined and louder condemnation of this brutal regime, and amplifying the voices of the people who are protesting and who sacrifice so much in this revolution. Thank you.
Danke. Monsieur Jordan Bardella.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bardella.
President. Thank you, President. We need to give a moral and unanimous support to Amin and to those that are standing up. They have decided to create this uprising against the imposition of the mullah and going all the way to the death to fight for the fact that they are absolutely on the same footing as men. But today I'd like to really point out that the Commission is very much contradictory. They're speaking out against the Iran, and yet at the time they've also had a point at which they were not paying attention to a situation of great gravity. So this is just one story, but it's one that is of great importance because it shows that there is an Islamism that is being supported by the European taxpayer. Fezimo, for example, Muslim women that you roll out a red carpet for at the European institutions. Therefore, you are not recognizing the identity of our nations and opening up a migratory policy that is outrageous and putting our continent at the just in a position of waiting for Islamization. So a continent that is absolutely one that should be of free men and women, Christianity, and never of fanaticism or headscarves or Islamism. Thank you.
Frau Doreen Ruckmacher. The floor is
Thank you, Chair. Dear Commissioner. Ik heb oneindig veel respect voor de vrouwen en mannen in Iran.
I have a huge amount of respect for the men and women in Iran who are standing up and opposing a criminal regime. This requires a lot of courage. You don't really need much courage to stand up here and say you're against what's happening in Iran. In Europe, I can dress however I want and I can speak out however I wish. Those protesters in Iran are endangering their lives in the hope of a better future, a safe, free future. So that is the responsibility of each government. These protesters need and deserve our unconditional support, not just because of the unacceptable death of Mahsa Amini, but as long as is necessary, as long as this unacceptable regime run by the Ayatollahs is still in power in Iran. Iranian women and all women around the world who are opposed to oppression, let me just say I see you and I hear you and I admire all of you and I am by your side. Thank you very much.
Merci. Monsieur Jérôme Rivière.
Monsieur le Président, merci.
President, thank you very much. Well, what hypocrisy here in the chamber this evening. We have a country being torn apart by demonstrations in the wake of the assassination of Mahsa Amini, who was arrested by the morality police for infringement of the hijab laws. And we have the same people pursuing a policy of the veil, talking about the freedom of the hijab, saying how wonderful diversity is. Well, diversity is, but the hijab will never be a symbol of equality. We've got women in Iran risking their lives, and we have communication campaigns which are being conducted by the Islamists in Iran. Now, we have been presenting the hijab in Europe as a signal of liberty chosen by women. Now, you should be supporting Iranian women who are taking the risk of walking the streets with their heads uncovered. So, you know, enough is enough. We have this hypocrisy surrounding the Islamic veil, which continues to be an instrument of oppression of men over women.
Frau Anna Michel.
Our next speaker is Ms. Anna Michel Azimakopoulou.
The death of Mahsa Amini is shocking, but sadly it's not surprising. It's not surprising to the people of Iran, whose basic human rights are routinely trampled on. And it's not surprising to the United States, which is accused by Ayatollah Khamenei of instigating the protests. And it's not surprising to Israel, which Iran wants to wipe off the face of the earth. It's not surprising to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which regularly engages in terrorist acts and is now carrying out raids on the protesters. It's not surprising, but it actually is terrifying that all of this comes from a country which is building nuclear weapons. It's even more sad that the European Union's response is currently basically statements and debates instead of actions. So please, High Representative, please, Mr. Borrell, surprise us pleasantly and do something. I call upon you to immediately take steps to designate the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as what it is, namely a terrorist organization. Thank you.
Thank you. Unsere nächste Sprecherin.
Our next speaker is Ms. Letitia Marquez.
Mahsa Amini's death at the hands of the morality police in Iran, because she didn't wear her hijab correctly, is an intolerable case of violence, and it violates the basic rights of women. It almost seems impossible that something like this could continue to happen in our world, that women are subjected to this, and yet it still happens. Today, it is a cry that we have to put out to all Iranians to support them. they're being so courageous in standing up for their rights and the end of oppression in their country. High Representative, the European Union absolutely needs to continue to act within the context of international organizations and with all of its relations with other countries to make sure that through all diplomatic relations are founded in the respect of women's rights. And this Parliament needs to do the same. Our foreign policy absolutely needs to be an absolute weapon to be able to stand up for these rights and defend them through and through.
Kollegin Al-Sahlani Abir zum
Ms. Al-Sahlani is next.
3 weeks of continuous courage shown by the women in Iran. Persian, Azeri, Kurdish women are paying the ultimate price for freedom, their lives. A courage that has not been met by you, Mr. Borrell, when you didn't take the opportunity during the General Assembly in the UN and took a stand for the women in Iran. Enough for the press releases now. Enough for the mumbling. It's time to speak out. It's time to act. The hands of the regime of the mullahs in Iran is stained with blood. Neither history nor Allah or God Almighty will forgive you for the crimes against humanity that you're committing against your own citizens. We, the peoples and the citizens of the EU, demand the unconditional and immediate stop of all the violence against the women and men in Iran. Until Iran is free, our fury will be bigger than the oppressors. Until the women of Iran are free, we are going to stand with you. Jian, Azadi, women, life, freedom.
Herzlichen Dank, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
Thank you very much. This is a difficult debate. And it's quite hard to break off speakers when they come to their minute or minute and a half speaking time. It's a very emotional, difficult debate. People are saying things that need to be said. So I'm trying to be flexible when it comes to the speaking time. But I will have to close the Catch the Eye speakers list. And we'll only really be able to get 2 or 3 people in, unfortunately, under Catch the Eye because of the way the speaking time is going, even though 8 people have asked for the floor. So please, I ask for your understanding, and please do try and stick to the speaking time as far as you can. So Ms. Gregorova is the next speaker.
Woman, life, freedom. I observe with deep admiration the breathtaking courage with which Iranian women stand these days against the dictatorship of Khomeini and his morality police. The message of the Iranian protests is universal and resonates across the world. It is heard by women in Poland and the US who are denied the right to their own bodies. It is heard by women in Italy, where ultra-conservative forces are coming to power. It is heard by women everywhere, where the same obscurants under different symbols wait for the nearest opportunity to trap free women in predetermined roles. That is why I think it is essential that their slogans are heard today in this room over and over again. Zan, Zendegi, Azadi. Thank you.
Thank you. The next one is Madame Simona Baldassare.
Grazie, Presidente. Thank you very much, President. Colleagues, the death of Mahsa Amini, 22 years old, for an infringement of the hijab laws is unacceptable. This is a symbol of oppression. There are women in the world who still live behind the fog of a veil, and we have 76 deaths and thousands of arrests in the last 2 weeks alone. And that is why I call on our foreign ministry, as well as you, Mr. Borrell, to use all the tools within your power to make sure that those in jail return home as soon as possible. Mahsa Amini and all the other martyrs of the Iranian regime must not be forgotten, and that is why I want to commend the efforts of the Italian Refugees Association, which advocates that we light a candle to not lose sight of the memory of Iranian women.
Next one is Herman Tertsch.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. There are terrible things occurring in Iran. We have the police from the terrorist regime of the Ayatollahs. A woman is beaten to death, murdered by the police for having shown her hair, for having not worn her chador, her veil, correctly. Something that the EU uses for propaganda and something they use in their own advertising and publicity. We have the police who are killing men and women who are protesting against this monstrous regime, more than 300, and this may well be the beginning of the end of this regime. We don't seem to be hearing too much in the European media, the social democratic media. We don't really hear very much because there are other interests at play. In 2019, there were 1,500 dead in the month of December. And just 1 month later, we were holding out our hand to this regime of assassins who had stained the streets of Iran with blood. It seems that there are some very powerful interests at play here. The EU needs to end its agreements with this regime. The EU needs to stop treating Iran as if it were just another partner. They are a terrorist regime. They cannot be one of our partners in any case. We need to end this EU policy financed by communists in Spain.
Nächster Redner ist Kollege David.
Our next speaker is Mr. David Lega.
All the way down. It's all the way. And the microphone's down. Thank you, Chair, High Representative. To the Iranian women, the change makers in Iran, we support you. I want to be crystal clear. We wholeheartedly support the aspirations of the Iranian people who want to live in a free, stable, inclusive, and democratic country. And we strongly condemn the compulsory hijab law. We condemn the morality police, and we condemn the brutal repression and violence. But words are not enough. I call on the EU and the rest of the world to take action. We need an investigation and we need accountability. The abusers must be punished. Actions do speak louder than words. That's why I hope that the EU High Representative will never wear the hijab in meetings with Iranian counterparts again. The former High Representative Federica Mogherini failed in representing our EU values. And that's why I hope the new Swedish Foreign Minister will never wear the hijab in meetings with Iranian counterparts. The former Swedish Foreign Minister, Ann Linde, failed in representing European values. Enough is enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Mr. Francesco Maiorino.
Siamo al fianco delle donne.
We stand with the women in Iran that are fighting on a daily basis in the name of freedom and dignity. Their combat is our combat. Repression that has currently been unfolding over the course of these weeks, it is impacting girls, women, and those who are making decisions for themselves. We know that this has already been something that has had an impact on our people of culture, of citizens that are not in line of the authoritarian regime. In the course of these days, we are seeing violent persecutions, torture, molestation, outrageous repression, and we've seen that Amini's death has led to further deaths, dozens at that. Our institutions absolutely need to respond, using their diplomatic relations without intimidation, standing up, helping the young people of Iran, those who keep repeating the three words that I would like to repeat here: women, freedom, and life.
Thank you very much. Salima Yembo.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Mahsa Amini,
Thank you very much. Mahsa Amini, 22 years old, died in Tehran at the hands of the morality police because a little bit of hair was showing from beneath her headscarf. And in Iran, across the world, as well as in Afghanistan, women have been demonstrating. This is a revolt which is being spearheaded by Iranian women along with men in the face of a regime which kills them. And I commend the courage of these women who are calling for their right to freedom despite the assassinations and oppression that incurs. The brutality of the regime has been shown because of the scale of the uprising, and we should therefore condemn this regime taking part in violence against women in Iran, and the United Nations is investigating this violence against demonstrators. We owe this to Mahsa Amini and all those who hope for a new world. So let's stand up and let us echo the words of our Iranian sisters: women, life, freedom.
Merci.
Thank you very much.
High Representative, the death of Mahsa Amini is a tragedy. The Iranian people have shown exceptional courage in the face of repression. I think the best way to condemn the violence was to give the floor to those who are actually protesting. I will quote a young Iranian, nameless, but someone that can give us hope. This young Iranian was going to leave their country, but decided to stay.
The world might have a wrong and distorted image from Iranian people, especially over the past decades. But we want to correct it. We are not this government. We hate it. We are Iranian from a country with more than 2,500 years history. We believe in love, peace, human rights. We hate brutal Islamic laws, and for this our children, our young people, are being killed by the regime. We might be arrested or killed. Mais continue-t-il? Ceci n'est que le début.
And he continues that this is only the beginning for a more profound change. They call on Europeans to help them to avoid any kind of agreements or compromises with the Iranian regime. Let us support these young people in their fight.
Thank you very much. And before I hand over the presidential chair, I'll give the floor to Evelyn Regner.
Horrified how the Iranian regime hunts down these brave Iranian women and men. But at the same time, I'm proud, very proud. I'm proud of every single woman standing up for her rights, standing up for the rights of her sisters and daughters. And I'm proud of the many men supporting women's rights openly. It is essential that all women around the world know that they are valuable, that they have rights. And these brave women in Iran are the reasons why these rigid structures begin to change. So we, as politicians from other parts of the world, have to show the Iranian government that we will not accept their crimes against their own citizens, not accept their crimes against these brave women. So rest in power, Mahsa Amini.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker is Mrs. Rafael. 1 minute, please.
Thank you, Chair. Since the murder of Kurdish Mahsa Amini, 92 people have died in Iran, only because a brave woman stood for her individual choice. And the individual choice of women in Iran is at stake. And all these women have fathers, just like Mahsa Amini had a father, a man. And I've been thinking of what's been going on in his mind? Did I protect my daughter enough? Did I give enough resistance? As a man in Iran, to the morality police, is this because of a piece of fabric and her identity that I lost my daughter? What if all fathers stood up against the oppressors of our daughters? Questions like these will continuously go through their minds in Iran. And only when these fathers, together with the strong women in Iran, stand up, they can change the regime of Iran. Commissioner, we are always clear about what we are against, but let's also be clear on what we stand for. These strong women currently in danger need a safe haven, and therefore I'm asking the Commission to investigate whether Europe can offer this to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Mr. Fernandez for 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, President. Vice President, High Representative, colleagues. First and foremost, we need to express our most sincere condolences for the family, the friends of Mahsa Amini. Unfortunately, and very sadly, she was assassinated by the Iranian regime, and we need to underscore that this is not a unique case. We even need to ask ourselves, is everything being done to condemn, to repudiate, and to avoid this sort of thing from reproducing itself? Now, the people of Iran believe in the rule of law. They're fighting for democracy, and therefore our duty should be to assist and to help those thousands and speak out for those thousands of Iranians who have been assassinated by the regime. And now I'd like to conclude on this point. The Commission should do all, not just to condemn all of this, but to take those tangible actions that need potentially restrictive measures that the High Representative referred to. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Mrs. Esteras Faragut. 1 minute, please.
Gracias, Presidente. Mahsa Amini, 22 años.
Thank you very much. Mahsa Amini, 22 years old. And she was detained by the morality police. This is the virtue police, and it is a scandal. She was beaten, went into a coma, and died 3 days later in hospital. This led to protests across the world and has led to hundreds of people being detained and injured in Iran. The Iranian security forces have responded in an extremely violent manner, and they are now allowing themselves to examine women's clothing, their headscarves, their hair, the clothes they are wearing, and even their makeup. And if they are found in breach, then they risk going to prison. These kinds of laws are denigrating. How can a country allow a situation in which a piece of fabric on a woman's head can lead to this situation? Women, life, freedom.
Antonio. Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Lopez Isturiz White. 1 minute, please.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President, High Representative, dear colleagues. The protests of the women and young people have spread across all of Iran. Hundreds have been killed just because they want to live in a free, democratic country. They want to have the freedom to live their lives, not under the rules of the Ayatollahs. They're being constantly and brutally repressed. Rather than listening to the voices of those who want reform, they have opted for repression, brutality, and the murder of their citizens. Rather than listening to the mothers and daughters in Iran, they have opted to censor their voices and to persecute them. It is our duty to shine a light on what is happening in Iran. Colleagues, a regime that does not listen or respect to its own people, are they really a legitimate actor with whom we should negotiate? We are often talking about not negotiating agreements with countries that do not respect human rights, but the EU is negotiating with a dictatorial and fundamentalist state, that of the Ayatollahs. We should no longer do this with this regime. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mrs. Walsh for 1 minute, please.
Mahsa Amini and the women of Iran are incredibly powerful. We've seen this firsthand in large part because of the instantaneous connection we all have through social media and the bravery of our trusted and free journalists. The young women of Iran have grown up in an age of digitalisation, of connectivity, and because of this are connected to the rest of the world in a way that older generations could never imagine. They explore, they learn, they decide for themselves, they hear the voices and see the faces of fellow change makers their own age. They are powerful. We are living in a time, thankfully, where young leaders are standing strong for their rights, for their freedoms, for their future. They too see fundamental rights are to be protected. Mahsa Amini should never have lost her life to hateful ideology, never. While the Iranian government works to cut these brave young women off from the rest of the world, we see what they are fighting for. These women will not be silenced. No woman should ever be. Their protests are fundamentally changing the course of history for the generations to come. We here in Europe stand with you in the spirit of Mahsa Amini. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Mr. Bellamy. For 1 minute, please.
Le monde entier reçoit une leçon de.
The whole world is learning courage from Amini and all of those who have lost their lives or at risk of losing their lives for the simple reason that they refuse to live hidden under a headscarf, and that's something that they did not choose and that is imposed on them. These women are 20-some years of age. They are giving Europe a lesson in courage, stating a freedom of conscience, and something that they are paying with the ultimate price. Now, High Representative, I'm not sure if sanction is the right word, but whatever the case may be, what needs to be done is something so that we are not silent in the face of the assassination of the youth of this country. Now, the European Parliament last June voted on any issue and a discussion of intersectionality in banning the headscarf. And where were the feminists that are trying to fight the patriarchy in our countries in the U.S.? Now, we spoke out against this campaign that the Commission was funded by EU funds to fight for the freedom of the hijab. So we need to wonder, accepting the hijab as at the head of the Council of Europe, are you not ashamed of this when you think of all of those who have passed in Iran? Amini, first and foremost, knowing that it is time to finally shed light on the guilty complicity that has led to this horrible event.
Thank you. The floor goes now to Mr. Stefanek for 1 minute, please.
Dear colleagues, current demonstrations in Iran following the death of Mahsa Amini are going on for almost 20 days now. These protests, which have been spread to all Iranian provinces, have been brutally repressed by the Iranian regime and so far led to 400 deaths and many injuries of people, including college and university students. In reality, the number of deaths could be much, much higher. I'm also very concerned about the fate of more than 20,000 of detainees where there is no guarantee that their fundamental rights are respected. This reminds me of the brutal suppression of the process in November 2019. We all know that the Iranian regime is responding with severe brutality, but despite this, the Iranian people are still on the streets. So I do believe that the European Union should act now and call on President Raisi to stop the pushback against the protesters immediately and free the political prisoners. People in Iran deserve the freedom and respecting basic human rights. Thank you indeed.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Now we have a catch the eye procedure, but as my colleague Otmar Karas already said, that we are much behind our agenda and timing, so I will give the floor only to three catch the eye speakers, and first one is Milan Zver.
Thank you, Chair. After this murder of Mahsa Amini, the Iranian people again arose first in 2019, and now once again, women are at the forefront, and this protest might lead to changes. But even years ago and also today, the Iranian regime is doing everything to prevent the rebels to achieve democracy and freedom. But I'm very glad to see today that the whole European Parliament is very united. We all support the Iranian opposition in their fight for democracy and freedom. This is good. But what does Europe need right now? All European institutions should be more effective and efficient in this fight. And we have not been so efficient over the last years. We have not been decisive enough against this regime, and this regime has now become even stronger. They are now a military and nuclear force, and they are threatening the whole region. Thank you.
The next speaker is Margarita Marques.
Muito obrigada, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. About 10 years ago, I was in Iran, and a young person was our guide and gave me an insight into the life there. And what we saw was that the hair would slip out from under the headscarf, and on a daily basis would leave the house to the university and was followed by those who were policing her morality. In 1978, the Iranian women began the fight for freedom. Now, we know that the morality police is there trying to condemn the women to be able to live in the way that they would like, to strip them of their rights. High Representative, we need European solidarity with these women, and now. It is fundamental and it is urgent. For all of those men and women that are with so much courage are standing up and demanding their fundamental rights. These are values that we have here in the European Union, but not only, they are universal rights. Thank you.
And now?
Solé, please.
The mullahs' religious fundamentalism killed Mahsa Amini, and the regime's repressive nature is killing now dozens of protesters, many of them women, who are demanding life and justice, life in freedom and dignity. All authoritarian regimes respond to popular unrest by claiming that they are the result of foreign interference, because they are simply unable to recognize that even under the most brutal circumstances, there are always citizens willing to sacrifice everything to defend human rights, human dignity and freedom. We have to stand by those protesting against the repressive rule imposed on them. We have to use all the mechanisms at our disposal to get the Iranian regime to stop persecuting dissidents, to stop imposing policies and laws that attack the most elementary human rights, and finally opens up to a country diverse in ideologies, thoughts, religions and minorities. A democratic country where Mahsa Amini would never have become the spark and the symbol that lit the fire of protest.
Thank you very much. We are closing HZI procedure, and I do apologize for those who didn't get the floor. So now I would like to give the floor to High Representative Mr. Borrell. The floor is yours.
Mr. President, honourable members, this long debate testifies your continued interest and engagement on human rights in Iran in particular. We all share the shock for what happened to Ms. Amini and for the violent repression of the protest. We also share the same support for the courage of the Iranian people who are demonstrating in the streets and facing a difficult situation. We will continue to follow what's happening in the country and to use every opportunity to raise our position and our concerns on human rights in Iran. As I mentioned, we will continue to consider all the options of our disposal, including restrictive measures. The Foreign Affairs Council will decide about it on the next meeting. This will be addressed at this colleagues in 2 weeks from now, and I am sure that they will react accordingly with your wishes and concerns. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have received 7 motions for resolutions to wind up this debate, and the debate is closed now. The vote will be held on Thursday. An announcement now. The Parliament, on the basis of Jury Committee, checks Patricia Chagnon, Maria Daci, Marina Mezurk, I apologize if I don't pronounce correctly, Eric Menardley, the mandates of those persons which came into force on the 9th of July, and also Mrs. Anna Miranda, which come into force on the 5th of September, and João